Hi, in this video we're going to look over Angular form validation, and if you have time I would advise you to go over Angular documentation, and they have some good examples. In this video we're going to consider some use cases that I find most common when dealing with Angular forms. At the very first, I assume you know how to create and run an Angular application, and we have here basic HTML markup that has a form and some fields inside of it like name, email and password, and a little bit of CSS, and nothing too special, and none of this I'm going to go over. And this is how it looks like. You have name, email and password, submit, which doesn't do anything. So let's start with the very basic and add here form ng form directive, and this is going to hold some information for us about our form, like if it's valid or invalid, what controls does it have, and so on. I'm going to mention just in case if you do get some sort of error that tells you that you cannot export, there is no such directive, some error like this, I'm going to show you. It basically comes down that you have to import this forms module. If you don't have this form module, it will tell you there is no directive with export as set to ng form. So you need forms module for this to work. And this is template driven forms, and for template driven forms you need forms module. And if you're ever going to work with the other type of Angular forms that Angular provides, it's going to be reactive forms module. And just in case you might need both, so if you're not sure which one you need, just import them both. In our case, we are going to deal just with template-driven forms, though. So let's start with the basic. We have this property on our app component data that's going to hold all of our data, name, password, and email. Those are the inputs that we have. And what we can do is bind those values to the property on our class. So this is how you do it in Angular, ng model, data name, and we can copy and paste this and add those to all of our values. It's going to be email and that's going to be password. Next, I'm going to mention, do not forget this. You will get an error if you're using ng model and you're binding this data, but you're not using name attribute. Angular doesn't need a name attribute here if you're going to use this ng model. And this is all you gotta do, just email and just password. After all of this done, we can go over to our application and look at some things. Here, if you inspect it, you can see that our class, this is our class that we've added input text, but you also can see it has ng pristine, ng valid, and ng touched. So if you focus on this input, it's gonna have ng touched. Just in case, let's look at the email input, which we did not touch. It has ng untouched. But as soon as we focus on it, it's going to be ng touched. And this is useful for us if we're going to do something with our validation, like add a red border or whatever, which is what we're going to do. So basically, these are the classes that we need, ng valid and ng touched. As soon as we know that it is invalid, in fact, and this is going to be special class ng invalid, and it is touched, so we're not just showing red borders as soon as the user sees the form. First, he needs to type something into the form or touch it. And then now let's just look over at our CSS, and that's going to be here what we have. For every input text that we have that has also class of ng invalid and ng touched, add to it border 1 pixel solid red. But now let's go over to our validation. What we can have here is put it over all on one line. If we put here required, Angular will track this and will mark this as invalid if user did not put anything in here. So let's go back. Let's look at name. It is untouched and it is invalid, but we do not see the red border because it is untouched and we need the class touched for the red border to come. So we touch it. Now we click somewhere else, and as soon as we do that, we see the red border indicating that there is an error here. Let's go back. You can also add some other validators like min length, let's say 3, and you can have max length, let's say 6, whatever. And it is the very basic text validation that you can set up here. Also, as we have seen, form also tracks if the overall form is valid or invalid, and we can do something like this. We can disable our submit button with dynamic disabled attribute based on whether form is invalid, and if form is invalid, it should be disabled. Now let's go over to our application. Submit is disabled, and as soon as we put more than 3 characters here, it becomes enabled again. For email, there is also a special directive here that's called email. So you can put here email directive, and it is going to validate it as email. But it's not going to show us red because it also needs to be required. Yes, it is. So now we pass here valid email and it is valid. One other thing you can use for validation is a pattern. And what pattern does, it allows you to use regular expression for your validations, and it can be set something like this. So this is a regular expression I found on the internet, and basically what it does is it needs to have 8 characters. It needs to have one uppercase character, one uppercase letter, and one lowercase letter, and one number. And this is going to pass our password. So this is our password. We press one lowercase, one uppercase, and one number. It is still invalid, but as soon as we type a lot of characters, it becomes valid. So at its core, basically, this is what you're gonna need for a lot of the form validation that you're going to encounter with Angular. And at last, I would want to mention that you can also provide more useful messages to the user based on what what validator exactly did fail. Like, first of all, you're going to need to have a directive ng model for the input you're using. Like here, I'm gonna name this. Well, it is a name, so I'm gonna name it name, and you can do something like this, and you can provide a user with some sort of useful message, like say if the name is invalid and the name is dirty or touched. And also what we need is name errors. Let's say min length. Name should be at least 3 characters long. Put it here. And so okay, it didn't work in our case because if we need to type something into this, basically because of this, name should be dirty or touched. And if we just remove this and have name invalid and name error min length, then as soon as you put this. Okay, so here's some debugging tip I have encountered. So it's not a debugging tip, it's actually something I've just encountered. So basically, if you're gonna show some users a message, it's gonna come down in order. Basically, first you should show if it's required or not. And that's gonna be like this, if name is invalid and also touched or dirty. Why we need this touched and dirty here is because if you remove this, as soon as the form shows up, it's gonna show name is required. Let's remove here should. Okay, now you have name touched or name dirty here. Name is required. So basically you would need this sort of messages for whichever validation fails first. So I think this is it. This should cover a lot of cases with form validation, and I might think of some new ones like using custom validators or building up reactive forms or like creating your own directive for validation, stuff like that in the next videos.